I'm going to show that sometimes the most beautiful objects are used for the ugliest of purposes. I get a call from somebody saying, would you like a printout of all the works of art by Damien Hirst that White Cube have got in their basement? The Salvator Mundi painting, supposedly by Leonardo da Vinci, sold in 2017 for $450 million, right? The world's most expensive painting. At auction, it had sold in 2005 for $1,000.
Wow.
And you might think venerable art historians after this, they'd go down to the police, make sure he never worked in the business again. But no.
2, 1, rolling.
This is StoryCo, the podcast about the business of story and storytelling. I'm James Kirkham. Let's get into it. Ben Lewis is an art historian, investigative journalist and documentary maker who spent a decade inside MTV and then a career spent reading the art market like a forensic investigator. What did he find? That the art market is an unregulated parallel financial system and narrative is its primary instrument for manufacturing value. At what point does art become something else? Deception, power. Today we get into all of it, but first let's begin where we always do. Ben, tell me a story.
Well, it's 2008, and I'm making this documentary called The Great Contemporary Art Bubble, for which I'm the director and the presenter. And I've sold the idea to the BBC on the basis that the art market is going to crash during the 12 months that I make this documentary. But there's no particular sign of it doing that. And I've sold this documentary to the BBC on the basis that I'm going to investigate the art market and uncover and pull away the curtain and reveal the corruption and deception, behind the facade of beauty. I'm going to show that sometimes the most beautiful objects are used for the ugliest of purposes. But the art market's totally opaque. I don't have anything, and I'm sitting there day in, day out at my desk typing away, trying to work out how to structure this documentary, how to have this great reveal, but I just don't have stuff. I mean, I'm not getting the interviews, no interviews with White Cube, no interviews with Damien Hirst, I'm not getting the material that I need to expose the art world. And then I get a call from somebody saying, I work at White Cube, would you like a printout of all the works of art by Damien Hirst that White Cube have got in their basement? And everyone knows that White Cube and making out at the time, I probably still do, but at that time making out that Damien Hirst is the most in-demand artist in the world, that there's a huge waiting list for his works. So it's quite a big deal if there's a lot of unsold works by Damien Hirst in White Cube storeroom. So I say, yes, please. And, IT security being what it was in 2007, if I can assure you they've tightened things up now. A few days later, I got something in the post that was a printout of every single work of art by Damien Hirst in the storerooms of White Cube. I'm like, this is quite good. But all the images are black and white and doesn't have the prices on. So I'm like, is there any chance, to my secret source, is there any chance you could send me this in colour with the prices? Sure enough, a week later, whatever, I got the same thing in the post in colour with the prices. And in the basement of White Cube, there was something like 200 unsold works of art by Damien Hirst with a value of £100 million. Right?
Wow.
The same value of works that Damien Hirst was producing new at the same time for this massive auction that he was going to hold at Sotheby's, this revolutionary auction. He was going to make all this new work. And instead of giving it to his dealers, White Cube or Gagosian or whatever, he was going to stuff it into the auction, give it to Sotheby's and sell it directly so he'd make all the profit. Because I'm quite slow-witted, I sat on the list for like a couple of weeks thinking, how do I use this? Is this really something? And then suddenly I was like, oh my God, I've got my whole documentary. And these months of depression that you get making documentaries and you don't know if it's going to be any good just vanished because I could see what I was going to do. I had to think if I put this in my documentary and all these facts and all this money and stuff, right, then there is a sort of problem because the BBC lawyers are then going to look at it and they're going to say, oh, is this in the public interest? Is this private? Is this corporate information? Well, I mean, obviously it would be in the private interest if it was politicians, doing dodgy stuff. But this is the art market. And I thought there was a very high chance that BBC lawyers might say, no, you can't use this. It's very difficult to use a leaked material like that. So what I did was I put on my other hat I was wearing at the time, which was London Evening Standard art critic, Bran Sewell's number 2. And what's relevant here is I was writing for the art newspaper, and I thought, I'm going to take this this inventory, I'm going to take it to the art newspaper, I'm going to film myself leaking it, right? I'm going to film myself leaking it, and then which I did, and then the art newspaper are going to publish it, right, as a front page story, but it's not going to mention my name anywhere, right? So there it came. It came out, of course, it was a front page story 2 weeks before Damien Hirst auction. It was huge. It went totally viral, and then all these journalists. It was a total stunt I'd organised, a total trap, if you like, a journalistic trap. So all these journalists then went to interview White Cube about it, right? Because White Cube wouldn't give me an interview. Sure. So I'd created a situation where White Cube had to answer this problematic question to other journalists. And then I went around and interviewed all the other journalists. And, White Cube, of course, had to admit they had this, massive inventory of Damien Hirst's work that hadn't been sold. And the line they gave was, well, we're so lucky to have so many Damien Hirsts,
Wow.
So anyway, then there's the auction 2 weeks later, and I think, right, this is really going to torpedo the auction, right? Because all these people who might buy at Damien Hirst auction, his collectors and his dealers, they might buy the work to kind of support the Damien Hirst market. They'd now be buying it knowing there was another £100 million worth of Damien Hirst works lying unsold they might have to buy as well. So it's going to torpedo the auction, right? It had no impact whatsoever, which I thought ultimately was really revealing about the art market. It was so solid, it was propped up by such wealth that little pipsqueak Ben Lewis and his inventory exposing this ginormous, deception by White Cube, had no effect on the market at all. And that sort of, I feel that Damien Hirst story is emblematic of my whole sort of working life, because it was a massive success to get the scoop, and a massive failure at the same time not to have have no impact on the auction. And if I could think of one neologism to define my life's work, it would be succesalia. Everything I've done has been sort of, apparently successful, but also actually a massive failure.
I'm going to thieve succesalia. I mean, I'm going to be using that now all the time. But surely that's more indicative of this, art world bubble that you're doing so much to kind of bring to the attention of so many, right? As opposed to just about yourself.
Yeah, I think everything's very ambiguous. Yeah, and art has no particular value, so it's quite difficult to work out whether something is a success or failure. And people pay vast sums for contemporary art these days, right? But as a friend of mine who was a curator at the Tate said to me years ago, he said, no one's got the slightest clue what's going to be valuable or considered good in 100 years' time.
They must do.
No, it's pure guesswork, and people. It's a bit like supporting a football team. These curators with their sort of buying budgets, they sit round a table and they all argue with each other about who they should be spending 150,000 euros on.
That's how it's decided, a kind of round table row.
So I understand. I'm sure they'll deny it, but everyone's got their little, the horses they're backing. One curator likes these guys, another curator likes these other women, whatever, and it's to and fro.
But there's, in other words, a stage and a structure to which the value is accrued from within the art, even in the most modern art now. That's how it's done right now.
It's a lot more, much more calculating. It's much more about, brand and producing work that sort of fits into art history and supplies a market.
Really?
And it's about, collectors and dealers working together to build up an artist's reputation art historically, but also commercially as something that people buy. And it's not unusual, this kind of behaviour. It's developed over hundreds of years, but we've witnessed a very intense moment of it for various reasons.
Did you always really? It's not a cynicism maybe you do have a natural cynicism, but as I say, it's investigative.
I sure do.
But it's investigative and it's exploratory, which I think are positive. Did you always have that when you were studying the game?
No, I had this kind of transformation.
Go on.
I did art history at university. I absolutely loved art. art history. I used to read so much stuff on my own initiative. Yeah, I was just really, really into it. And then it was very difficult to get, work writing as an art critic or as making TV programs about art. And I didn't get any particular breaks, despite the advantages I had in life. So if I went to work for MTV...
Yeah, gear changed. So I was hugely into art and I went to work for MTV.
Yeah.
I mean, great. This was the 90s, right?
Yeah, it was 89.
Pretty cool place to work in Camden Town here in London. Yeah.
Well, I had this other I had this other side to me that was like super trendy, and I worked at the Fridge nightclub doing visuals at the Fridge nightclub.
The Fridge in Brixton.
Yeah. For Friday night.
I wasn't expecting this. Yeah. Really, you were doing the visuals in the Fridge.
Yeah, they had this whole gantry. Do you remember? There was this old cinema, and they had this whole gantry. And we had like eight slide projectors and 8 Super 8 projectors on film loops. And we had this analog thing that was meant to sort of sync everything up, but it never worked. And you spent the whole night running up and down the gantry, fixing broken film loops and trying to get the slide projectors to work. So I had this sort of,
I mean, that in itself feels like performance art. But you weren't an artist prior. You studied it, but what you're describing there is inherently creative. We're mocking and joking and describing tech from a bygone era. But that's a creative process, right?
Yeah, it was very creative, and I wanted to be more creative than perhaps working in art galleries would have allowed me to be. I wasn't very market-orientated, selling art. I mean, I actually really admire art dealers. You have to sell art all the time, persuade rich people to buy works of art. I mean, that's a great skill.
So take me from the Fridge era, and then 89
so
turns 90.
So I kind of had this trendy other side. So, I went to work for MTV after my posh university degree. And then, once I'd acquired all the skills, these sort of TV skills I learned on the job at MTV, I then got little jobs on magazine shows for BBC and Channel 4, like car programs or history programs or whatever.
Interesting.
And then one day I had my break for an art story because I heard that Channel 4 were looking for an idea to make a film about this famous, young German photographer called Andreas Gursky, but they didn't want sort of a normal classic documentary. Channel 4 always wanted something really wacky in those days. So I pitched. I mean, it took me 20 minutes. I pitched the Gursky lookalike contest. I would go around Britain taking photographs that looked a bit like Andreas Gursky's, because Gursky hadn't really taken any amazing photographs in Britain. And then I'd go over to his studio and show them to him in Dusseldorf and try and persuade him to come to Britain to take photographs of Britain. So I would be taking Gursky's, and obviously they wouldn't be nearly as good, but how would he react? And anyway, got commissioned 5 minutes later.
But that feels a real vision of what was to come in your career. It feels like you're playing there with perception and, dare I say it, fakeries and what's deemed valuable, right? Was that the first
totally ambiguous, yeah. And it also made the viewer want, is Ben's stuff any good? Is he being serious? I was a daft art nerd in that programme, and I then turned that into a series called Art Safari. It's like, yeah, I'm not an art critic. I'm going to be an art nerd. That's going to be my niche. I'm going to be the guy who wants to be an art critic and doesn't always get it right. And I made a couple of series like that.
Great.
And about all these artists who are now huge sellers. I mean,
really?
Like Maurizio Catalan, Takashi Murakami, Sophie Cao, Matthew Barney.
And what era was this?
That was 2003 to 2005.
And now selling for a fortune.
Yeah, I mean, they were... I can't really boast that they were unknowns at the time. That's nonsense. But
I think we can say you discovered them.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, they were small. They were big in the art world and unknown outside the art world at the time. And the BBC4's head, Roly Keating, wanted something really fresh and new and original, and didn't care if I wasn't dealing with household names. Totally different from now. And he commissioned it and just said, "Do whoever you want," and I did, and made this sort of funny, wacky series where everything's a stunt. I got tattooed by an artist.
Really?
On his pig farm in China.
What's the tattoo of?
It's a Mickey Mouse on a crucifix.
Wonderful.
With Minnie weeping at the base.
Wow.
And I was a big cheerleader for art, but then something happened, and like in a way I should have remained a cheerleader, because my whole shtick was like how wonderful artists were, and all these brilliant artists with amazing ideas and art was this kind of way of engaging with the world of ideas.
So where did the
visually.
daft art nerd cheerleader turn into the
Because
cynic?
the market just went crazy. I mean, like 2006, I remember thinking, like, these prices, they're insane. Like it's $30 million for a Roy Lichtenstein. And I think Roy Lichtenstein's a brilliant artist.
And again, for those of us who don't know, these were huge step change in value at this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a Roy Lichtenstein would have cost $1 million in the 90s. I don't know.
There was a colossal difference. And in your head, did you think, I don't know why? Because we kind of skipped over it, but you'd done news at MTV. So, you've got a journalistic background. You wanted to know why?
Yeah, I wanted to know why. And the money was just sort of seemed to be blowing all artistic value out of the window or just overshadowing it completely. And I was like, but I also felt like really strongly at the time, if the ultra wealthy are able to spend this much money on art like this, even though I think the art's very good, if they're able to spend this much money on art, there must be something going seriously wrong with the world economy. And that was from my perspective as a, art critic, wacky art critic in 2006. And, I to this day, I still think that I was seeing in the art market the seeds of what happened in the financial crisis and the rise of Trump and populism.
Go on, explain a bit more there. So the art market is like a canary in the coal mine for the global geopolitical, geoeconomic kind of shifts. Go on.
Big claim, isn't it?
No, but I love that, obviously.
But it's just that sense of all that money sort of going right up to the top, to this tiny, tiny percentage. I mean, what about all the people at the bottom? What are they getting? And then these people right at the top, what were they, with this huge amounts of money, what were they spending it on? Like, occasionally it was, great art, whatever, maybe. Occasionally Francis Bacon, though God knows if Francis Bacon isn't worth $80 million. Come on, that's ridiculous. But they were also spending vast sums on stuff that was really, really bad, really cliched, really derivative, of which there was an endless supply, like Damien Hirst spot paintings.
So explain that a little bit, because when you're talking about this increased value, I could argue, or perhaps people do, that it's classic capitalist market economics. There's a bubble. We might go back to my beloved sport of football. In other words, if the demand is there, but we all assume it's a bubble, and at some point the wages will stop again. But you're saying, no, it's a little different.
Well, you're right to bring up football, because there as well, too, there's all this silly money sprayed around, insane amounts of money on footballers and this and that. I don't know anything about football, but, I know what the headlines are. But obviously there's a big difference between football and the art market, because football's a mass market and the art market just isn't.
That's a great point.
But there were lots of rich people. They had lots of money. It was the boom years of the early 2000s. Our financial crisis, there was all this quantitative easing. So there was a lot of easy money around.
So
interest
ironic.
Rates were very low.
Yeah.
What were people going to spend this money on?
Yeah.
They weren't buying crypto in 2010, were they?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So a lot of this money went into art.
So they could hoard the wealth, but are we saying that the artists of the era and now had more, if you like, Machiavellian or strategic ambitions than merely I'm creating something of worth to myself, and if other people like it, great?
I think the problem is that art history became the art market, and artists, many artists, not all, started making art for the market, and a lot of art became a kind of product range.
Really?
Of which Damien Hirst spot paintings are a perfect example. Endless iterations of the same thing, all the same, but all different. And it was possible, it's possible because it's quite easy to sort of pervert traditional artistic activities into something very market orientated. I mean, every artist has a style, doesn't he? But what happens when that style becomes a brand? When you're just doing the same thing over and over again? Well, you get endless works of art that are all the same, and they all cost a lot of money for a while, and then they're going to be worth nothing.
So how does he retain his value as an artist, or is that?
Well, he doesn't.
Really?
No, I mean these days he makes most of his money from prints, as I understand.
Really?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I don't know the figures. I don't know his account books, so I can't. I can only.
But your point on it being a brand and a templated approach and a machine, monetized machine producing en masse, as opposed to a more traditional perspective of what art is. And is that happening a lot?
Even with a good artist, like it became a sort of parody of itself. Like a sort of, you'd look at the art formulas of the 60s, and then you'd sort of do them again in a poppy way for the 90s. So even like a really good artist, or at least a widely admired artist like Felix Gonzalez Torres. Okay, so go back to the 60s, or was it the early 70s? Richard Serra, seminal artist who makes huge things with sort of cast steel and stuff. But one of his early works was getting molten lead and just throwing it into the corner of a gallery. And then it sort of dries and makes a sort of little mountain. So what Felix Gonzalez Torres did, whose art was all about sharing and a lot about being gay and community and everything, he took a load of boiled sweets and piled them up in the corner of an art gallery. And the difference is anyone could take a boiled sweet and have it. That was his way of sharing. But it's still like, it's still art that looks like art. Or this sort of rectangle, the sort of geometry of minimalism. It's all rectangles, cubes, squares, stuff like that. So, you get sort of Ai Weiwei, who, when he did this big installation at the Tate, it was all these little ceramic sunflower seeds, weren't they, sort of all spread over the floor into a vast rectangle. Well, the origins for that lie in the monochromatic rectangles of paintings from the 60s and early 70s, or in, Carl Andre's rectangle of bricks. It was almost like, the formulas were so familiar, they could just bring them back with a bit of a political twist.
That's a shame. Is that the nature of, dare I say, culture, full stop? Or was that very specific to this more strategic artist looking to make money by borrowing from the past?
I mean, all art history has a sort of continuity. Something now follows on from something before. Look what happened in the late 19th century, the art boom. We had sort of Renaissance painting, and then Baroque and, neoclassicism. And then in the late 19th century, the art market boomed with this kind of cliched neoclassical art, right? That had all the same tropes as, Renaissance art or whatever, all this stuff that had gone on in 19th century British history. At the time, this sort of art made record prices.
Really?
Yeah, could make $4 million at auction in Christie's. But, this is sort of the 1880s, 1890s, 1870s. But, by 1910, you could buy one of these works of art for the cost of the frame. Right?
Wow.
Now, why? And people sort of, people then have to explain. It's only when the value really crashes, and the only buyer of this kind of art today is Andrew Lloyd Webber. Slight exaggeration, but it's only
it's single-handed.
It's only Andrew Lloyd Webber who buys the really bad late 19th century art. But it's only when the market crashes that everyone goes, "Oh yeah, of course that stuff was a formulaic parody of what had gone before. Yeah, that was the last decadent phase before people totally reinvented art in modernism." And I think that's what how we're gonna regard the art of the last 20 years.
That's interesting. So is it always about our framing of the work?
Well, I mean, the Salvator Mundi painting, supposedly by Leonardo da Vinci, sold in 2017 to the ruler of Saudi Arabia for $450 million, right? The world's most expensive painting. And at auction, it had sold in 2005 to these pair of dealers who spotted it for $1,000.
Wow.
And the family that had owned it for 30 or 40 years received $700 for it, which is like really, really shocking, I find, that these people who looked after what is apparently an important painting for so long got $700 and that's it.
But did they know its importance then?
No.
Or was it simply the ignorance around the piece and who was behind it?
Well, the tragedy is that they didn't have a clue about its importance. They just sort of family. The dad was in construction, lived in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, in a white wooden house. Quite a sort of classic house, moderate, not particularly wealthy, not particularly poor. They had this stuff they'd inherited. The tragedy is that the owner's niece, was an artist, and she thought some of the works that they had in the house might be valuable. And when the owner decided he was going to sell it, and the patriarch of the family decided he was going to sell the work, she said, hold on a minute, let me take photographs of everything and send it up to Christie's. And she did. She took photographs of all the works of art and sent them up to Christie's. And Christie's came down to look at stuff to see if there's anything worth auctioning, that they thought was worth auctioning. And they did pick out a few pieces, but not this Salvator Mundi painting. Right? Because
they just missed it.
Well, yeah, it was heavily overpainted. It looked crap, like a lot of these sort of
just
paintings.
Assumed it was a cheap sort of fake forgery or copycat, not even attempting.
Exactly, a copy, bad 10th-rate copy.
Really?
Yeah, so they passed on it. So then it was the family had to give it to the local auction house, and it was picked up for a song.
Again, though, is that been going on for decades, full stop, that these pieces are just missed, and then at some point someone recognises something or the brilliance behind it or the person who once painted it, and then, the market then does the rest?
You're right. This has been going on forever. It's called a sleeper. This was just the most extreme example of it in the entire history of art. I mean, people are always discovering, buying at auction works of art for 5,000 or 10,000 quid that then they sort of restore up a bit. And then it becomes apparent they buy a better artist, and then they're worth 10 times as much. I mean, that happens all the time. But this is really extreme. We were in a really extreme moment for the art market, which we're just coming out of.
Right.
And it's so extreme that it's so shocking that instead of you just saying, well, that's the nature of the business, art dealers are entitled to make money out of their expertise. Come on. It's just so extreme. You start thinking, no, but yeah, they're entitled to make money, but not on that scale, and not at the expense of, ordinary family, an ordinary apple pie American family.
I mean, the fact that Sotheby's missed it. But again, for the uninitiated, I'm thinking, well, God, that must have been bloody good. I.e., this notion of forgery, the people who can even make paintings that look a bit like, I think, well, wow, you must have incredible craft. Or this notion of restoration. Tell us about where these lines blur, because it is a bit blurred, isn't it? It's
so difficult, especially with Leonardo. I mean, the Salvator Mundi had two problems. Was it so damaged in its once you took away all the overpaint and restorations of past centuries, there was maybe 20% of the original picture surface left. Yeah, was it so damaged that it couldn't be considered any more a Leonardo, which is what art historians and dealers decided earlier in the century, those who saw it in the first half of the 20th century. There was another issue. Once it had been restored, had it been restored so much, so heavily that it had become a fake, which is a word art historians use to mean a little bit less than a forgery. Had it become a fake? So those are the two questions, right? If it ever was a Leonardo, is it still a Leonardo? And has it been over-restored that it's a fake?
Yeah.
Well, the first question, is it so damaged we can't think of it as a Leonardo anymore? Well, that's like an unanswerable question. I mean, look at The Last Supper, right? That's really, really damaged, but everyone thinks that's a Leonardo. So that sort of goes out the window or becomes a object of debate.
Do you think there's any line that can be drawn there? In your opinion, then, if Leonardo's hands crafted that in the first place, even if over hundreds of years, 99% of it has had to be restored, in my head, that's still his start point and a product of his mind, right? It's still a Leonardo, no?
I think the arguments can only be have to be quite complex, if you like. They have to be a bit more sophisticated than that. And I think that the restoration was overdone by most contemporary standards. Right, it went further than most even generous restorations today. So there was way too much restoration, and I think it was so damaged that we can't really say if it was a Leonardo or not.
So it's the fact that we can't be sure.
Well, there's not enough left of the picture for us to know if it's a Leonardo or not. So
it's the knowing.
The first problem is that the protagonists, the sort of art historians and dealers and museum curators who think it is a Leonardo, haven't made a very good case. You know, it might be, but we don't know.
Right.
It was bought in the end by the Saudis, you know, and it's a real sign of the art historical and in a way geopolitical moment, like why it went for 450, because the Saudis are pivoting away from oil. They're building all these new museums.
That's interesting.
They need stuff to put in their museums. They're working with the French. Right, you know, working with all these French cultural managers and museum people. I think somebody from the French camp must have pointed out this picture to the Saudis and said, you know, the 80% of the people who come to the Louvre come to see the Mona Lisa, and look, here's something that could be a Leonardo, might be a real destination work of art, might really put one of your museums on the map. Maybe you should go for it.
So the fact that it accrued that worth, that value, as you say, born from a geopolitical reason, that they wanted something that supposedly came from where it did via the hands of Leonardo. It has a provenance attached to it and a story and a tale that people will retell, right? Is that what it's all about then?
Well, yeah. I mean, when you sort of attribute a work of art, right, you're basing it on the style of the picture, but also the story behind the picture, right? When you make a forgery, you know, you don't just forge the picture. You have to forge. You don't have to, but you would normally also forge documents that told you the history of that picture, the provenance, because people want to know where it came from. They want to be comfortable they can trace that picture back to, you know, Leonardo's studio or, you know, this or that collector, if not who bought Leonardo's. And the problem with the Salvator Mundi was there was no documentation of this picture, no certain documentation of this picture any time before 1880. But, you know, there's mentionings of Leonardo Salvator Mundi, you know, words, or Leonardo, whatever, God the Father, or such analogous terminology that would make you think this could be the painting in royal inventories,
really?
in the inventory of one of Leonardo's followers. And so they took all this, right? The protagonists, the people, dealers and the art historians advocating the authenticity of the Salvator Mundi, they took all this material, uncertain material, and claimed it as the provenance of their picture. And you often get this because, you know, it's the best they could do. Right? There was no certainty at all. And what happened in the very early stages of researching my book, you know, I was looking at their provenance story, probably in the collection of Charles. This is the Salvator Mundi that Charles is mentioned in Charles I, whatever, inventory. This is probably the same picture, you know. And then I started looking at all these other versions of the Salvator Mundi. There were lots of different versions that were painted in Leonardo's workshop or in Milan by his assistants or followers. And one of them was in Moscow, right? One of them was in Moscow. I looked through this catalogue and they had a photograph of the back of the picture, right? And it had a dirty, great Charles I stamp on it. Yeah, that was the one. That was the one that we know must have been in Charles I's collection.
Wow.
So the dealers and protagonists, when they were confronted with this evidence, which I discovered, and somehow, despite their years of experience and knowledge, they'd overlooked, I don't know why. And anyway, this thing that I discovered in like 4 weeks, they were like, yeah, but the back of our Salvator Mundi has been sort of planed down to even it out later, and so the stamp got rubbed off.
And is it because, it's story and tale and imagery from the past and historical kind of moments, right, that are romantic and we want to believe? Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we all want to believe in that story that, you know, a long-lost Leonardo has been rediscovered.
Yeah.
And it's really it's a really appealing story, and also just all the arguments about whether it is or isn't a Leonardo are really appealing. I mean, it's a whodunit, isn't it?
Very much so. But I guess that as soon as you've got such a scale of belief, people can leverage that for more nefarious means to hike value.
Yeah, it adds value. Yeah.
And
I mean, Christie's marketed it as The Last Leonardo.
Wow.
It was also the title of my book. But if I could sort of, live all my life again, then I would call it, not The Last Leonardo, but The Worst Leonardo.
Wow.
I mean, it might be a Leonardo. Who knows? Lots of good art historians think it, whatever remains of it, was painted by Leonardo and his assistants. They think it's from his studio, which is pretty close to being a Leonardo.
But that doesn't weave its spell on you. That doesn't leave you with a magical feeling that it could have been.
I think it's a very odd picture.
As simple as that.
Yeah. And there are, the art historians and connoisseurs and curators who don't think it's a Leonardo. Yeah, there's a sort of phrase that art historians use as shorthand for all the complicated thoughts they've had about why something isn't genuine. They just go, it's a really irritating phrase. They just go, yeah, the picture's not right.
So ambiguous. When we were talking then about wanting to believe, tell us a little bit, or explain again to me, a fake and a forgery. I thought the same thing. What's the difference?
The difference between a fake and a forgery, that's quite difficult to put one's finger on because the words are used somewhat loosely in art history. If you look up the definitions that I've done, then a fake is a picture an original picture that's been restored to a level that it looks better, looks like it's by somebody better than the person who actually painted it. A forgery is something, if you like, something painted from scratch as a copy or imitation of an artist's style.
Oh, wow. Now, again, it feels like both have an incredible craft attached to them. The lines between fake, forgery, restoration, mastery, they feel incredibly... I'm not sure where those lines are.
Everything is relative, and a forger only has to be better than the art historians and dealers who are looking at his pictures and attributing them. So in the early days of art history, if you like, in the 1890s, for example, which is the period I studied because there's a book I've been writing, the forger might produce work that's pretty crap. And you look at it now and you think, how did they ever fall for that? But, they were just developing art history and they were just trying to piece together the complicated history of the Renaissance and attribute all these unsigned, undocumented works of art. And art history was just developing as a discipline, and the forger was a step ahead.
So they weren't really corrupt. These people were used, right, and leveraged. Is that how the art world's then always worked?
Well, that's the sort of departure point for this book I've written. I spent 4 years basically in seclusion writing this book about an Italian forger from Siena, active in the first half of the 20th century, called Federico Gioni, who no one's outside a small circle of art historians have ever heard of. But anyway, the sort of key scene, the sort of opening and the question of the book, what is the difference between restoration and forgery? The greatest English-speaking art historians of the day, Bernard and Mary Berenson. They were writing the history of the Renaissance, a new history of the Renaissance in the 1890s, going all over Italy, finding these undiscovered works, advising big collectors. And they started trying to buy some works on the side. They didn't have a lot of money, so they had to buy the cheap stuff and then try and deal it themselves. And they bought what they thought were a load of cheap, original Sienese, early Renaissance Sienese paintings, right? And then they sort of did a couple of basic tests on them and discovered they were forgeries. So, embarrassing. Who is the forger? He must come from Siena. They go off to Siena, ask around, is anyone in town, do you know anyone in town who's really well known for doing really amazing copies of these Madonnas on gold grounds and old early Renaissance paintings? Oh yeah, it's that guy Federico Gioni, and he lives down this alleyway. So off they go to see him, they doorstep him.
Oh, wow.
They go in, they discover it's him and his whole team in flagrante, faking a Madonna on the left here and adding a bit of sort of aging process, a bit of dirt to another one they'd finished on there and letting others they'd just done dry in the sun. And oh! And he's like, and Federico Gioni's like, oh, nice to meet you, fair cop. Yeah. Oh, look, here's my photo book. Here's some more I've done. I look at the photo book and go, oh, look, I recognize some of them. And you might think that after this, right, these venerable art historians, after this, they'd go down to the police, report him, tell all their dealer friends to watch out, make sure he never worked in the business again, the forger. But no, they're like, wow, you're such a good forger. Would you consider working for us as a restorer?
This is great.
I hope so. That's a sort of provocative and entirely truthful opening scene of the book.
But the provocation seems to shine such a fascinating light into the art world, full stop.
I love that whole underbelly of art history, and that's my shtick. Okay, yeah, I'm investigating the art market, but in a way it's to show it's a much murkier place than people think.
Explain
like
the
the
level
way
of
art history is written is much murkier than people think. It's about art historians, getting forgers to restore important Renaissance paintings for them, and then that being sold to American collectors, and then American collectors going crazy for that art, which they did for Sienese art in the early 20th century, and then that art ending up in American museums, and American museums going, oh shit, our early Italian collections are seeded with over-restored and forged works of art. How do we solve that? And then everyone getting into X-rays and technical art history and chemical analysis of the pigment, and that developing art history. It's like, yeah, art history is really exciting. Like other areas of life, it's got all this conflict and this underbelly. And anyway, that's my whole territory. That's what I really like to tell stories about.
I can understand why, because my God, that's compelling. Even when you mention about forgery, I can't help but see it in a romantic kind of light from the past, and these incredible people. It's still painting to a level that I could only ever dream of.
And I love these topsy-turvy. I love stories that are topsy-turvy,
Yeah.
like where the world seems to be inverted. All the rules seem to be inverted. Like the art historians hire a forger. Like that's an inversion. But this story's got loads of inversions because this forger, Federico Gioni, he was such a celebrity in his hometown
Really?
that when the socialists won the local elections in 1920, they appointed Gioni head of the art school.
I love that.
And that was just to give the finger, right? Just to give the finger to all those art-loving noblemen.
That's
all the
so-
art-loving nobility who'd been running Siena for the past 400 years.
God, there's so much to that. Is everyone cognizant in the art world of this? Does everyone know? Like, how deep and dark does this go?
Well, there's all this good stuff about art, that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Like, all that's valid, but life's not black and white. There's also all this nefarious stuff. And, yeah, people are jostling with each other and making calculations. And I think, if one looks at the sort of commercial art world, yeah, it's a lot more about building alliances and partnerships and investments and marketing. It's a lot more about that than Joe Public realise.
But art manages to play this role of... It plays into your romantic yearning, right? Is it all orchestrated then for that reason?
Well, I think there's a lot of conflict as well as, collaboration. Like all aspects of human life.
A lot of people talk about the wider economy right now, like a casino economy. Look at polymarkets, look at meme stocks.
Totally.
There feels like there's similarity, and I would never have realised, I would never have aligned these two worlds. But there's similarities, right, to what else is going on out there with what I thought was a far more refined space of the art world.
Yeah, I think the art market set the template for selling products that have, no inherent value, whose price or value is only the mind of the market. I think there's a template in the art market,
Really?
in the gallery world, in Christie's and Sotheby's that was kind of absorbed, a lesson that was absorbed by, polymarked, crypto, NFTs.
Yeah.
And that's why there was a massive NFT boom a few years ago, and NFTs were works of art with a crypto valuation, on the blockchain. I think that's why it was very symbiotic, the relationship between the art market and crypto. Crypto was like, they managed to have these auctions for NFTs where people could pay with crypto, right? And for crypto, this was really important that they were sort of getting closer to the real economy by getting into auction houses. Well, at the time, as an April Fool's joke, I sold a NFT, right, which was the Salvator Mundi. Instead of blessing, he's holding a wedge of dollars. I got it sort of, altered on Photoshop, whatever, and I sold it as an NFT. And we ran a story on it in the art newspaper. Anyway, I sold it for 3,000 quid.
Good lad.
Just like that. And I have to tell you that I gave the money to charity.
Good.
Because as an investigative journalist, I don't want to make money out of art. Like, that's unethical.
But you were proving a point.
I was proving a point, yeah. It was this little stunt.
What's next, going into the end of this decade, into the 2030s? Is anyone really learning? Are we just going to carry on as we are? Is it going to be as kind of complicated and...
Well, the mania for contemporary art is ebbing away.
Right.
The market's crashed about 20% a year for the past 3 years.
And do you see that continuing?
Yeah, and sort of spreading into different sectors of the market. At first it was just these sort of relatively small galleries that were closing. Now it's a big gallery like Pace shedding 50 of the artists on its roster and, removing 50, letting 50 of its workforce of 300 go, whatever, really downsizing. The whole...
do you think that's sad, or is that like a, inverted commas, market correction?
Well, they say correction, I say crash. One man's boom is another man's bubble. I mean, these terms are so relative. There's always a sort of lighter way of looking at it. If you read the art press, it's like this is a correction. The old model is unsustainable. We're looking for exciting new ways of presenting and selling art. But I think that's all a bit of wishful thinking. I think the problem is that we've now got something a bit like the end of the 19th century when more and more of the collectors, if you like, and the dealers are realising that the art was insanely overpriced and a lot of it wasn't very good. Problem. And I think that will reach to the top. It's just like the blue chip work's still insanely expensive nowadays. Like it's not like prices for Monets have gone down or Francis Bacon maybe a little bit, but not really. Not the or Klimt. Yeah, prices for Klimt not gone down. So the blue chip stuff, they'll still pay top dollar for it. Prices are stable, or record prices are still being set. But eventually, even those, I think, the tsunami of revisionism about the value of art will sweep over those works of art too, and everything will become much less expensive.
What about the seismic impact of AI on society? Will that see a yearning for the originals, for the creators, for the artists, the things that can't be copied and mimicked and made in 3 seconds by a bot? Or is again that wishful thinking from me?
No, I'm with you on that one. I want more and more of it until there's this sort of tipping point, and then people go in search of originality and original ideas and people who tell stories and make art in different ways.
I feel like you've taught me so much. I feel like it might make me reappraise art, modern and old. I guess that's a good thing.
It doesn't mean that great art hasn't been made in the past. It's just a question of understanding, the social and political and economic context in which it was made. And if you're more informed about that, you might come to a different judgment about its quality.
I love that. I think that's such a lovely place to finish. Ben, thank you so much for coming on to Storyco. Could not be a more perfect example of why we do this show.
Oh, thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this week's show, please follow us on Instagram at StorycoPod. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Trust me, it really does help. Storyco is a Telltale Industries production. It's recorded in Studio One at the brilliant TYX Studios here in King's Cross. It's produced by Jago Lee, assistant produced by Nellie Batt. Special thanks to Craig Hepsinstall, Jack Freegard, Tyler Newton, Issa Gibson. I'm James Kirkham. This has been a masterclass in how storytelling pays in this modern media landscape. Go out, tell a story that matters, and we'll see you next week.